Hello, welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, my name is Stephanie and I appreciate you stopping by. I'm back today with 6 all-new spring and Easter decor DIYs that are both easy and affordable. I'm trying to declutter my craft stash, so I'm crafting my stash today. Most of these projects have a rustic or primitive touch to them, but can easily be changed up to fit any home decor style. Let's go ahead and jump into project number 1. For this project, I used this 6-pack of golden eggs from the Dollar Tree and started by using Waverly chalk paint in the color plaster to paint 2 of the eggs. I then used Waverly chalk paint in the color sandstone to paint 2 more of the eggs, and finally Waverly chalk paint in the color hazelnut to paint the remaining 2 eggs. Once the eggs were dry, I took some Waverly chalk paint in the color ink along with a stencil brush from the Dollar Tree and speckled the eggs. I got a little bit of paint on the end of the brush and used my finger to flick the paint on the eggs until I was happy with the way they looked. While the paint was drying, I used hot glue to attach some Spanish moss inside each of the cups on the egg carton, creating little nests in each one. Once I had the moss in place, I then placed the eggs back in the carton, nestling them down inside the moss. With the eggs in place, I went ahead and added more moss between each of them. I wanted the moss to be a little less messy, so I took some scissors and trimmed up any of the extra long pieces. Next, I took one of these brown paper tags from this pack of craft tags that I picked up at the Dollar General and taped off around the edges to give it a border, then used Waverly chalk paint in the color plaster to heavily dry brush the center of the tag. Once the paint was dry, I removed the tape and used a fine point black Sharpie to write out the words Farm Fresh Eggs in the center. Next, I took a piece of jute twine and wrapped it around the carton of eggs long ways and tied it in a knot on the top right below the first 2 eggs. I then took another piece of jute twine and wrapped it around the carton just around the short side this time, just below the first 2 eggs, and secured it in place with a double knot over the first piece of jute and cut off the bottom 2 excess pieces of jute. Once I had the jute in place, I fed the tag on one of the tails and secured it to the top of the carton, tying a small shoestring bow on top. To finish up this project, I used 3 of these lavender sprigs from this pick that I got at Walmart and used hot glue to attach them to the back of the tag at the top just under the bow, and this one is finished. This one was super quick, but I think it turned out really cute, and the best part is I can keep this out year-round. Moving right along to project number 2. For this project, I used one of these small glass jars from the Dollar Tree and started by removing the sticker on the bottom as well as the lid. I then used folk art chalk paint in the color sage to paint the outside of the jar with a couple good coats. While the jar was drying, I printed out these 4 adorable bunny images on a piece of this really thin multi-purpose paper from the Dollar General, and I will leave a link to print these images for free in the description box below. I rough cut one of the images and used a small paintbrush with a little bit of water on it to go around the edges of the picture, then while it was still wet, carefully ripped off the excess white paper. I then repeated this step to cut out the remaining 3 images. Next, I took some matte Mod Podge and applied a light even layer to the front side of the jar and placed one of the images in the center, making sure to smooth out all of the lumps and bumps in the paper. I then continued to repeat this step until I had one picture on each of the other 3 sides of the jar and allowed it to fully dry. Once it was dry, I went back over the entire jar with a thin, even layer of Mod Podge to seal in the images and the paint. I then used Waverly Antique Wax to lightly distress the jar. Since I wanted the lid to look like it was rusted, I took some matte Mod Podge and applied it to the sides of the lid, and then took some cinnamon and heavily sprinkled it over the Mod Podge and tapped off the excess. I then went back over the cinnamon with another layer of Mod Podge to seal it in place, and while it was still wet, lightly sprinkled the cinnamon back on top, again tapping off the excess. I continued to repeat these steps until I had the entire lid covered and set it aside to dry. Once it was completely dry, I gave it a coat of Mod Podge Gloss Clear Acrylic Sealer to really bring out the rusted look. After everything was dry, I simply replaced the lid and took some of this black and white ribbon from the Dollar Tree and wrapped it around the lid and tied it in a knot off to one side and trimmed up the ends. To finish up this project, I made a small multi-loop finger bow out of some jute twine and used hot glue to attach it to the ribbon on the lid where it was tied together and trimmed up the tails, and this one is finished. I love how this simple little jar turned out. What do y'all think? Let's move on to project number 3. For this project, I started with 4 of these wooden shims from this pack that I picked up at Lowe's and started by sanding them a little to remove any splinters. I applied a generous amount of hot glue to the back side of one of the shims, then placed another shim on top, making sure the large end was flush with the large end and the small end was flush with the small end. I then repeated this step to stack the other 2 shims. Again, making sure to keep the large ends flush with the large ends because this is going to be the top of the carrot. Here's how it looked once it was assembled. I did go ahead and make a total of 3 carrots and used Waverly chalk paint in the color pumpkin to paint them. Once the paint was dry, I took Waverly antique wax and moderately distressed each of the carrots. Next, I used one of these small raffia bows from this pack that I got from Hobby Lobby back in the fall, as well as 3 pieces of foliage from this pick that I picked up at the Dollar Tree, and finally 2 pieces of boxwood from this pick that I got at Walmart. I applied some hot glue to the bottom of one of the foliage pieces and attached the other 2 pieces on either side. I then used hot glue to attach the boxwood pieces to the front of the foliage arrangement and finally used hot glue to attach the raffia bow to the bottom of the arrangement to create the greenery for the carrot. To finish up this project, I turned the carrot on its side so that you could see the sides of each shim and applied a dab of hot glue in the center of the top of the carrot and set the greenery arrangement in place and held it until the glue set up. I then repeated these steps to attach the tops to the other 2 carrots, and this project is finished. These turned out so cute and can be used in so many different springtime displays. Alright, moving on to project number 4. For this project, I used 6 of these 5-gallon paint stir sticks from Walmart and started by taping 5 of the stir sticks together so that I could easily cut off the handles so that they were all the same length. I then cut 2 pieces from the last stir stick that are a little over 7 inches long. Once I had everything cut to size, I used a combination of wood glue and hot glue to attach one of the shorter pieces about 1 inch from the bottom of the 5 other stir sticks to attach them together. I then repeated this step to attach the other piece to the other end, being mindful about keeping it spaced about 1 inch from the top. After I had the sign put together, I took Waverly chalk paint in the color plaster and heavily dry brushed the front and sides. Next, I took this scrap piece of 3/4 inch wood that I picked up at Hobby Lobby and cut 2 pieces, one at 10 inches and the other at 6. I then used a combination of wood glue and hot glue to attach the 6-inch piece on top of the 10-inch piece to create a cross. Once I had the cross put together, I used Waverly antique wax to stain it, leaving the back of the 10-inch piece free of wax. While the cross was drying, I applied some hot glue to the center of the sign and placed some brown Spanish moss on the left side and some green Spanish moss on the right. I then applied hot glue to the back of the cross and placed it down in the middle of the Spanish moss mixture at a slight diagonal across the sign and held it in place until the glue set up. I did go ahead and take some scissors and trim up the Spanish moss so that it was a bit neater. Next, I took one of these brown paper tags from this pack of craft tags that I got at Dollar General and used a black Sharpie to write "He is risen" on the front, then attached some jute twine to the top with a large head knot, and finally used hot glue to attach it to the back of the cross off to the left side. Then to finish up this project, I attached a jute hanger with some hot glue, and that's it for this one. Y'all, this one is hands down my favorite out of all of today's projects. I have a feeling that this one is going to be a permanent addition to my everyday decor. Let's move on to project number 5. For this project, I used one of these round cutting boards that I picked up on clearance from Walmart and used Waverly chalk paint in the color plaster to paint it. Once the paint was dry, I applied an even layer of Mod Podge on the front part of the cutting board and set it aside to completely dry. While that was drying, I printed out this bunny image on the same thin paper from Dollar General and used the water method to rip off all of the white paper. I will leave a link to this free printable in the description box below if you want to print it out. After the Mod Podge was dry, I placed the image in the center of the cutting board and placed a piece of parchment paper on top, then took my mini heat press and went over the top of the image to reactivate the Mod Podge and adhere it to the cutting board. I then took some more Mod Podge and gave the entire cutting board one even coat to seal the image and paint in place. Once that was dry, I used Waverly Antique Wax to lightly distress the entire cutting board. Next, I took some larger jute twine from Walmart and wrapped it around the bunny image twice, using hot glue as needed to secure it in place. I don't like twine fuzzies, so I took a lighter and burned them off, but that's completely optional. I wanted to cover up where the jute started and ended, so I applied a generous amount of hot glue right above the jute on the bottom of the image and applied some green Spanish moss on top, pressing it down into the glue. I then took some scissors and trimmed up the moss to give it a nice finished look. Next, I made this messy bow out of some random scraps of fabric and jute that I had in my stash and used hot glue to attach one of the raffia bows from Hobby Lobby in the middle and used the excess jute on the back of the bow to attach it to the handle of the cutting board. Then I took another one of the brown paper tags from Dollar General and used a Sharpie to write "Hopping Down the Bunny Trail" on the front, then heavily distressed it with Waverly Antique Wax. I also went ahead and wrinkled it up in my hand a few times to give it a more old and worn look, then attached a piece of jute with a large head knot and used hot glue to attach it to the cutting board right under the raffia bow. Then to finish up this project, I replaced the jute hanger in the handle with some thicker jute from Walmart and cut off the excess, and this one is finished. I am thrilled with how this cutting board turned out. I think the addition of the Spanish moss made a huge difference. And last but not least, project number 6. For this project, I used this picture frame that I got at Goodwill and started by removing the hanger on the back as well as the glass and backing. I cleaned up the wooden frame and decided that I wanted to keep it exactly how it was. But for the back piece, I used Waverly chalk paint in the color sandstone and gave it one light coat, not worrying about covering it completely. I then took some Waverly Antique Wax and distressed it to give it a more rustic look. Once the paint was dry, I flipped the frame over and applied a line of hot glue along the inside edge and replaced the backing, holding it in place until the glue set up. Next, I took 6 of these scrap pieces of jumbo craft sticks that I had in my stash and cut them down to 10, 8, 6, 2, 2.5, and 2 inches. I then painted the pieces with Waverly chalk paint in the color pumpkin and used Waverly Antique Wax to distress them. Once the pieces were dry, I took these stamps from the Dollar Tree and used them to spell out the word "way," then used some charcoal colored ink to stamp it onto the 2-inch piece. I then used these stamps to spell out "Hippity Hoppity, Easter is on it" on the remaining 5 pieces. After the ink was dry, I placed the craft stick pieces in the middle of the frame to somewhat resemble a rough-looking carrot and used hot glue to secure each one in place once I was happy with the way it looked. Next, I took 3 of these scrap greenery pieces that I had in my stash and used hot glue to attach them to the top of the frame, holding them in place until the glue set up. I then took some scraps of ribbon, burlap, lace, and fabric and created a messy bow and used hot glue to attach it to the top of the frame right in front of the greenery stems. Then to finish up this project, I found this large black button in this jar of buttons from the Dollar Tree and used hot glue to attach it to the center of the bow, and this one is finished. I think this one turned out really cute and it fits perfectly with my spring decor. And that's it for all of today's projects. I hope y'all really enjoyed these super quick, easy, and affordable projects and are inspired to create your own rustic home decor for spring and Easter using things that you may already have in your stash. Let me know in the comments below which one of these projects is your favorite, and please don't forget to give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it, as it really does help me out here on YouTube. And if you haven't hit that subscribe button yet, what are you waiting for? Click that button and stick around for a little while. I have tons of fun projects on the way. Also, let me know what kind of projects y'all are wanting to see in the comments, and I'll see what I can come up with. I'll see y'all next time.